Released in North America in late 1992, Contra Force for the NES is a peculiar entry in the system's library. In fact, I would go so far as to call it a Konami anomaly. The gameplay of any given Contra game was well known by this point in time. The adaptations on the NES elevated the fun factor of their arcade counterparts, and Contra 3 The Alien Wars delivered a 16-bit entry in the first quarter of that same year, 1992. On paper, Contra Force seems like it should be really good. Two-player cooperative play, destructible environments, a weapon power-up system similar to Konami's own shooter titles, and even the ability to use CPU-controlled teammates with selectable battle plans. The problem is there's so much slowdown present that gameplay feels more akin to watching Chariots of Fire than it does having an experience playing Contra. So the question is, why does it slow down so often? After a bit of research, I believe I have an answer. Contra Force contains the MMC3 mapper chip inside its cartridge, and using that chip was a mistake. So was it not programmed well? Honestly, I think its code demonstrates legitimate programming skills. So was it unoptimized? Yes, I believe programming would have preferred more time to tighten up performance. These two things in mind, my bold claim is that the game's primary performance woes likely stem from a regrettable business decision, at least from a gamer's point of view. Before we jump to my conclusion and explanation for this claim, let's analyze Contra Force's slowdown. First of all, we always talk about NMI occurring during each frame of video output. The CPU executes the code for the next frame at the same time the PPU is drawing graphics for the current frame to the television. The PPU signals the CPU that it is done drawing and it's time for updates for the next frame. We call this interrupt NMI. The CPU can provide updates for the PPU and perform other maintenance before the process starts over and we draw the next frame. Most of the time, the CPU completes logic for the next frame before NMI occurs. When that happens, it is placed in an infinite loop to wait on said NMI. Contra Force has a unique structure for this approach, but it is similar enough that we can represent it in the event viewer the same way we would for other games. I've instructed the debugger to mark this infinite loop in the event viewer using these pink boxes outlined in purple. Because we execute the same loop of code over and over, it creates a striped pattern on the screen. If we let it roll, you can see that our loop of wasting time occupies a fairly large portion of the screen for our current area of the game. This makes sense. We have one player, no current input, no enemies, and no animation. If we halt execution, you can see that the CPU needs about this much time to complete work for the next frame. The remainder of draw time for the PPU would see the CPU just wasting time, with a few exceptions when a non-NMI interrupt occurs to execute logic related to the HUD. The takeaway here is that the CPU gets all the work done and has time to spare as it waits for the moment it can start working on the next frame. While the event viewer can showcase when specific events take place, there is another option built into the emulator that lets us analyze performance. The performance tracker will graph the CPU usage and the game's FPS as an overlay inside the game window. We are standing in our less eventful area of the game. The tracker itself is graphing our performance by showing the game's FPS in yellow and the CPU usage in red. The graphs for each are superimposed. When viewing the yellow line, use the FPS indicators. The top means 60 FPS, the middle means 30 FPS. Simple. When viewing the red line, use the CPU indicators. The middle means 100% of CPU time. So you can see that we are running at a steady 60 FPS and it takes around 55 to 65% of CPU time per frame to process everything we need to do for the next frame. I also have a lag counter showing. The counter is currently 0 as we are rendering every frame on time. If we start firing, jumping, and aiming in different directions, the CPU usage increases. The red line goes up. As we get right up around that 100% line, we experience a few lag frames. If we stop firing and stand still, the line returns to the normal range of CPU usage. Without enemies on the screen, let's add a CPU-controlled teammate and watch performance. I'll select front cover for Smith and return to action. The frame rate drops in half. The CPU line spikes up to about 100% and the lag counter really starts to roll. As the timer for the CPU teammate runs out, the CPU usage drops and the frame rate returns to normal. Once again, all of this happens without any enemies on the screen. So this gives us an idea of just how bad the performance of Contra Force is. This in mind, let's go the other way. I've located the subroutine for the sound engine. We can disable it with one Game Genie code. We hang on the last note played, but we also eliminate some of the variance in CPU work that is created by sound instructions. Let's restore the sound engine. So unfortunately, we've experienced performance issues without any enemies on the screen. If the game is designed to target 60 FPS, this shouldn't be happening. If we load a different save state with 2 players and an enemy that is constantly attacking, you can really see a consistent hit in performance. A game targeting 60 FPS has been slowed down to 35 FPS, and this is now the norm. It will remain that way until we take out that enemy. If we do so, the game kicks back up to 60 FPS, but it barely makes it. If I shoot these crates, we have a momentary dip in performance. With the crates gone and 2 players just standing there, the CPU usage is around 85 to 95%. So we barely achieve 60 FPS with 2 players just standing there doing nothing. 1 player starts shooting, and it's bye-bye 60 FPS. Obviously, we have a problem. Look at the difference in generating a new frame by way of the event viewer. In our less stressful area, the CPU finishes the work with time to spare. It completes the next frame by using less than a single 1/60th of a second window of time, so to speak. In our busy area, the CPU does not finish before NMI. We don't enter a loop to waste time because we didn't get the work done. NMI code executes and we return to working on the frame. The CPU only needs this much time to complete the work it didn't finish, but the damage is done. We missed our NMI deadline back here, so we have to wait for the next one. Just like that, it took 2 frames worth of time, or 1/30th of a second, in order to compute a new frame. Performance drops in half for this moment in time. The more stuff we have on screen, the more often it is going to happen because we have more logic for the CPU to process. It was not uncommon for 2-player simultaneous games on the NES to target 30 FPS in order to alleviate needing to perform all the work for the next frame within 1/60th of a second. Konami themselves were quite familiar with 30 FPS design. Apparently this was not in the cards for Contra Force. Why wasn't it designed for 30 FPS with this much of a workload? And while that question bakes your noodle, let's talk about mappers. The NES can address up to 32K of program ROM and 8K of character ROM. Character ROM contains the graphics. If we use a debugger to illustrate the addressable areas for both the CPU and the PPU, you can see those regions in the bands below. After the release of the Famicom in July of 1983, it didn't take long for developers to require the full addressable area of the system for code data and graphics. It was obvious that software needed to find a way to overcome these limitations in order for games to evolve. Over a period of about half a year, that evolution kicked into high gear. Super Mario Bros. Uses the maximum addressable areas and ships with 32K of program ROM and 8K of character ROM. 2 weeks later, City Connection ships with extra chips in the cartridge, and the extra chips allow the software to switch which 8K graphics bank is seen by the system. Thus, mappers are born. In February of the following year, the Famicom Disk System was released. It uses a RAM cartridge to occupy the program and character regions. The disk system's BIOS can be accessed to load data from the disk into the RAM areas. The games are cheaper to produce but require load times. 2 months later, Sunsoft's custom ASIC dubbed Sunsoft 1 was used inside Atlantis no Nazo. Custom mapper chips are introduced and other companies pick up on the trend. This is the way. While this is not even close to a complete list of custom mapper chips, it demonstrates a variety of hardware options inside the cartridges and also showcases how Konami marched to the beat of their own drum. Or at least that's what they did in Japan. When the Famicom was released as the NES outside of Japan, Nintendo wanted to control software sales. They limited companies to 5 games a year and handled the manufacturing of cartridges themselves. To get around the 5 games a year limitation, Konami created the Ultra label. Easy. Now they could release 10 games a year outside Japan. But what about Nintendo manufacturing the cartridges? That meant Konami couldn't use their own mapper chips. They had to use the MMC mapper family from Nintendo when it came to releasing Konami games internationally. There are 2 important things to understand here. First, using a mapper chip is not like swapping out a video card in a PC and updating some drivers. This is a noteworthy change. You change the feature set and have to change the code in the game that is responsible for bank switching, for example, as the instructions are different for each mapper. Second, follow the money. Gamers questioning a company's decision can easily find their answer by thinking about profit before technology. Is this decision worth it? Mapper feature set and money were likely to be in play as games were released. I think both of these were part of Contra Force's fate. Heck, the first Contra game required a significant pivot. The Famicom version used Konami's VRC2 mapper chip and included a graphical introduction, cutscenes, a map between levels, and background animation during gameplay. One feature of the VRC2 was the ability to split the 128K character ROM into banks of 1K, and therefore have 8 switchable banks of this size. This feature was used to cycle the tree graphics contained in a single 1K bank to simulate wind blowing through those trees during gameplay. How do you port this feature to an MMC chip outside of Japan? Perhaps the MMC3 would be best, as it can switch the first half of addressable character space in 2 banks of 2K, but also switch the second half of banks in sizes of 1K. Perfect, right? Problem: the MMC3 does not exist yet at this moment in time. The MMC1 can bank switch the character ROM in banks of 4K. That won't work unless you can somehow use a colossal character ROM with lots of redundancy. Wasted space. Now what? Konami would end up cutting a lot of graphics for the North American release of Contra. In fact, they cut the character ROM itself from the cartridge in addition to the VRC2 mapper. The character ROM was replaced with 8K of character RAM, and the graphics were stored in the program ROM. Code would then copy the graphics from the program ROM to the character RAM during execution. Quite a pivot in terms of an international release. Why did Konami cut so much out of Contra outside of Japan? Well, think about mapper feature set and/or money. Question answered. I mentioned code for bank switching. Boy, does that ever come into play with Contra Force. Let's pop the hood on mapper logic. The CPU clock speed of the NES and the speed of an NTSC television signal determine how many CPU cycles we have per frame of video output. This number may seem rather high, but we have quite a to-do list each and every frame. Each instruction takes multiple cycles. Let's make up an example. Say you are processing 4 enemies on the screen. Collision detection and movement are perhaps stored in different banks. These are 2 things you want to process each frame for a 60 FPS game. How do you handle it? Don't worry about syntax, let's talk in pseudocode. You could loop through each enemy, bank switch to collision detection first for the current enemy, perform the logic, bank switch to movement, and finally process movement for that enemy if it is still alive. Fairly straightforward. You're looking at 8 total bank switches for this sequence. Alternatively, you could loop through the set of enemies twice, bank switch to collision detection, loop all enemies, bank switch to movement, and loop all enemies. Which method is better? It depends on several things, of course. This scenario is fabricated, but I will say that the bank switch logic in the first TMNT game that uses the MMC1 mapper chip requires 46 cycles. Loop logic might take 20 cycles. What is the better use of CPU time? Perform 6 extra bank switches to get through all 4 enemies in this example and use 276 extra cycles, or perform only 2 bank switches but add an extra loop that costs 20 cycles. Obviously, the double loop here is faster with only this computation information provided. This question is rhetorical and the example is made up. If everything is made up, perhaps the best answer is just put enemy movement and collision detection inside the same ROM bank. Aha! Now you see one of the most important components of designing a game that uses bank switching. How do you distribute your logic across the banks in such a way that is most efficient? The mapper you use determines the size of the windows used for bank switching a large ROM, as well as the required code to perform the switch. The more code required, the more CPU time lost each time said switch is performed. Let's use a real-world example to take a look at mappers alongside relevant code. Tiny Toon Adventures was released for both the Famicom and the North American NES in December of 1991. The Famicom version uses Konami's VRC4E mapper, while the NES version uses Nintendo's MMC3. So we have a Konami game that was likely developed for both mappers at the same time, as the 2 different versions were released at the same time. Here's the bank switching code for the program ROM regions for both versions. You can pause and skim through if you'd like, but here's the gist of it. The subroutines used for the bank switching operation allow the previous bank ID to be backed up and then restored later. A similar operation can be performed and also set a flag to let code know that perhaps a temporary bank switch is in progress. Each release has its mapper-specific code. The MMC3 release would appear to have separate subroutines depending on if the flag or non-flag versions of the pre-bank switch routines are called. Both the VRC4E and MMC3 bank switch the program ROM with banks that are 8K in size. The VRC4E version has two 8K banks fixed to the second to last and last 8K regions. It switches both the lower two ROM regions fairly often during that time, and they switch in consecutive pairs. If we give it an 8, it switches the first two banks to 8 and 9. If we give it a 2, it switches the first two banks to 2 and 3. So we bank switch 16K at a time via two banks of 8K. The North American release with the MMC3 bank switches in the same manner. This similar implementation of both versions doesn't require too much overhead, even with the logic that saves off the previously used bank ID. Using the VRC4E version, let's check the CPU usage of this bank switching logic. Just like with Contra Force earlier, we can include the infinite loop logic after the game frame's logic is complete. This early screen isn't a challenge. If we load a later screen, we see that it takes longer to get the frame's work done, but we still finish with time to spare. We can add blue boxes for mapper register writes to the event viewer. This places a blue box overlay whenever these two writes from the code occur. If we freeze a single frame, you can see how often a pair of bank switches occur during that single frame. But this doesn't tell the whole story of CPU time, does it? Obviously, the support code needs to be represented in the event viewer in order to get an idea of CPU time lost to bank switching. So let's add watched breakpoint boxes that cover this entire area. Now we have a better idea of bank switching time. It is certainly noticeable, but it doesn't appear to cause any issues as we still have time to spare, at least with this early example of 3 enemies I found. Side-by-side CPU time and frame time paired with the event viewer showcase the difference in performance between the Japanese and North American releases. While there is a difference in performance, both versions have CPU time to spare. We can apply this same style of bank switching analysis to Contra Force. Speaking of which, Arc-Hound was teased in Japanese magazines in 1991, and the game was expected to hit the Famicom in October of that year. It never happened. Arc-Hound would later be released as Contra Force in North America in late 1992. This seems like a business decision to recover costs after the market started leaning into the Super Famicom. Hey, our Contra brand sells well in North America, we could release Arc-Hound as a Contra game. Ah yes, which mapper chip do we use? This is most definitely a late-era Famicom game that leans heavily on skilled programming and a capable mapper chip in order to get the job done. We received Contra Force in North America and know that it used the MMC3 mapper chip. That's the easy part. But what mapper was it designed to use in Japan? I don't think it was the case of the VRC4E like Tiny Toons. I think it was designed to use something superior to that, such as the VRC6. The VRC6 can swap 16K banks of program ROM into the lower half of the addressable ROM area. It can also swap 8K banks inside the third quarter area just after that. The last 8K ROM bank is fixed. Convenient. 24K of total switchable space. Akumaju Densetsu used the VRC6. What about the international release? Castlevania 3 used the MMC5 mapper chip. The MMC5 has a solid bar's worth of modes available for bank switching both the program ROM and the character ROM. For the program ROM, Castlevania 3 uses Mode 2. That is one 16K bank and two 8K banks. All banks are switchable. This is a very VRC6 compatible friendly flavor of an MMC chip. It makes sense that Konami would select the MMC5 for an international release of a VRC6 game. Whatever the cost of using the MMC5, it was perhaps worth it for a new Castlevania title. Also, it takes all of one line of code to do a double 8K bank switch for both mappers. Why is all this relevant? Well, Contra Force uses the MMC3, and it seems like it was shoehorned into that mapper. If we take a look at the bank switch code, we see that it doesn't just provide a single value and expect to switch two adjacent banks to consecutive numbers. It uses the provided number to calculate an offset and look up which pair of bank numbers are needed for the change, selects each bank, and changes them appropriately. That is a heck of a lot of code to perform a double 8K bank switch. Independent of support subroutines, you're looking at 36 cycles for an MMC3 double switch with Tiny Toons to 57 cycles for an MMC3 double switch with Contra Force. The obvious question is, why do we need to look up which banks to use? Here are the numbers used to calculate the offset for the lookups, and here are the pairs of bank numbers retrieved from those lookups. While some numbers are consecutive, others are mixed. Do we need 4 and 5, or 4 and 6, or maybe 4 and 1? If we track all bank switches for one frame for this scene, we end up with this list. That is a lot. The bank switch subroutine executes 38 times. That is 2,166 cycles lost to bank switching, and again, does not include any support subroutines. Did we need to switch banks this many times? Are the contents of the banks unoptimized? Could code be resorted into different banks in order to reduce the number of switches required? Optimized for the MMC3 or not, the primary issue is that perhaps the game was designed for another mapper. As mentioned, both the VRC6 and MMC5 mappers used for the releases of Castlevania 3 have the ability to switch the C1000 region in addition to the lower half of the program ROM window. Imagine coding the game to use 3 switchable banks of 8K each and then finding out you need to dial it back to only being able to switch 2 8K banks. Now you have to figure out which bank combinations you require for executing your various bits of logic. Perhaps you move to a temporary lookup table with the intention of redistributing your code later, and later never happens. I suppose those of you watching might say that perhaps the MMC3 style of bank switching was always the target mapper method, and the work was just never optimized. That's fair. However, if that is the case, at what point in the development process would a programmer give birth to this monstrosity? Finally, the moment we've all been waiting for, the percentage of frame time used in Contra Force to execute bank switching. Every single box you see on this event viewer is CPU time spent on bank switching. You obviously cannot eliminate all of it. Maybe you could optimize it, but maybe it is optimized as much as possible. More than that though, what if you had the flexibility of the VRC6 or MMC5? You'd have an extra 8K bank you could switch, and the instructions, and therefore cycles, required for the switch would be significantly reduced versus the MMC3. So what about a solution? Well, it wouldn't take that much work to convert it from using the MMC3 to the MMC5 or VRC6, but remember, changing the instructions to those that are compatible with the desired mapper is only a fraction of the battle. The ideal way to fix it would be to identify all the code and data in the ROM and restructure them in such a way that frame-by-frame bank switching is minimized and a lookup table is no longer necessary. The resulting game could be executed on a flash card that is responsible for emulating these mapper chips. In an ideal scenario, the optimization is such that the game runs at full speed on real NES hardware, minus the flash card, of course. Meanwhile, the solution up to this point in time has been to overclock the emulator. Give the emulated NES more time to finish up the next frame by raising the clock speed. Quite an easy way to make up for a lack of optimization. Of course, then you realize how Ninja Turtle-like the physics are, but that's another subject. Please like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video and would want to see more like this one. I also have a Patreon available if you are interested, and thanks for watching.